You are going to be my conversation partner on the topic of whether or not student loan debt should be forgiven. I want you to take the position that student loan debt should be forgiven. I'll take the position that it should not. Keep your responses to about 60 seconds or less. I will try to do the same. If you believe anything I say is incorrect, please correct me. I'll try to do the same for you. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and give my opening statement. I believe that student loan debt should not be forgiven because it is fundamentally unfair to those who made responsible personal finance decisions. Those who chose not to go to college because it would have been a bad investment would be punished by not receiving the same amount of money that is going to those who are receiving student loan forgiveness. Those who paid off their loans are also punished. Those who worked through college so as not to take out loans are punished. And those who were irresponsible and either chose bad majors, bad institutions, or who shouldn't have gone to college altogether are ultimately going to be rewarded for their poor financial decisions. What happens with student loan forgiveness is the costs of bad investments are socialized to taxpayers while the benefits of education are privatized. So a good example of this is an individual who attends college, accumulates about $40,000 in student loan debt, hasn't paid down their loans yet. It gets $40,000 from the taxpayers in the form of student loan forgiveness, despite the fact that most taxpayers don't have a bachelor's degree. And this individual, we'll assume, accumulated a bachelor's degree, is likely to have higher lifetime earnings than those who ultimately funded part of this bailout. Now, another problem with student loan forgiveness is that it creates a moral hazard. What I mean by moral hazard is it socializes the cost of bad decisions while the benefits remain privatized, as I kind of previously explained. Now, this concept, when applied to private equity firms, venture capital firms, and hedge funds, is rightfully called out as something that is immoral and unjust. So a good example of this is that many Democrats would oppose a bailout to a private equity firm that had some investments that didn't pan out. They would say that that private equity firm should actually have to pay the costs of their bad investments, of their losses, and they would object to a government bailing out those losses. And a good reason that they should object to this is because when you socialize the costs of bad financial decisions, there is less of an incentive to make good financial decisions. So ultimately, I'm objecting to forgiving student loan debt on number one, the ground that it is unfair to those who made wise financial decisions. And number two, the moral hazard that it creates not only for future student loan borrowers, but also for those in other industries, such as private equity, venture capital, hedge funds. And you could also argue those who would be taking out loans on their homes, those who are going to be taking out mortgages, because the message would be that if you can't afford your mortgage in the future, government would bail you out of that bad financial decision.
All right, I hear you, and I appreciate the thoughtful argument. I'll take the position that student loan debt should be forgiven. First, it's not about rewarding bad decisions, but addressing a systemic issue. College costs have skyrocketed. Tuition's up over 1,200% since 1980, while wages have barely budged. Many borrowers were sold a dream that a degree guarantees a good job, but for millions, that's not true. 40% of grads are underemployed. Forgiving debt would free up economic potential, letting people buy homes, start businesses, or save, boosting the economy for everyone, not just borrowers. Your point about fairness is valid, but it ignores how the system pushed people into debt with little financial literacy or real choice. On moral hazard, forgiveness could be paired with reforms, like free public college or interest rate caps, to prevent future debt traps, unlike bailing out Wall Street, which often lacks such guardrails. Also, your example of a $40,000 bailout oversimplifies. Most plans cap forgiveness at $10,000 to $20,000, targeting lower-income borrowers, not high earners. What's your take on how the system itself sets people up for this debt?
That's a great question. First of all, I just want to address the point that you made as far as the costs of college are high. Well, forgiving student loans would only make the cost of college go even higher because individuals would be less price sensitive, since even if they do the math and realize that they're not going to be able to pay back the loan, they'll trust that the government will step in and bail them out when they're not able to pay it back, since they already did it once, and they'll assume that they'll do it again. And so this would allow colleges and universities to raise prices even more. So the argument that costs are high and therefore we should forgive these student loans is actually very, very incorrect, since it would actually allow colleges and universities to raise prices even more. You also mentioned that these individuals didn't have a real choice. No, they absolutely did have a real choice. They just made poor decisions. I think you asked me at the end, you mentioned means testing. So why don't you just go ahead and clarify for me then, would you be against student loan forgiveness that is not means tested. So for example, giving up to $50,000 worth of forgiveness for all individuals, I assume you'd oppose that and say, no, we should means test it, have some sort of sliding scale so that people who are earning more get less forgiveness. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yeah, you nailed it. I'd oppose blanket forgiveness like $50,000 for everyone. Means testing makes more sense. Targeting relief to lower-income borrowers ensures help goes where it's needed most, not to high earners who can pay it off. Your point about rising college costs is fair, but forgiveness alone doesn't cause that. Schools hike tuition because of bloated admin costs and state funding cuts. Forgiveness could be paired with reforms to cap tuition or tie funding to affordability. And on choice, sure, people make decisions. But when society pushes college as the only path to success and buries 18-year-olds in complex loan terms, it's not exactly a level playing field. How would you address the fact that many borrowers were misled by schools or lenders about job prospects and loan terms?
Yeah, so if borrowers were actually lied to, then they can file lawsuits and they can try to recover whatever amount they would be owed in damages on the basis of what is essentially what would be fraud if there's actually a conviction, if found guilty, if institutions, lenders, whoever is found guilty. But I have to object to sort of your phrasing around the way that these students are receiving the loans. The way you're phrasing it sounds like the loans are being shoved down people's throat and that they're not actually signing on a dotted line saying, no, I want the loan. They want the loan. And now what essentially it sounds to me like you're doing is you're saying that someone is actually a victim if they receive capital. Now, there's some sense in which I can understand what you're saying, right? The federal student loan system doesn't take into account if you're actually going to be likely to be able to pay back the loan when you get it. And that's why we should shut down the federal student loan system. But to say that someone is a victim because they were able to receive a loan for college, I think is a bit of a stretch, especially when you say that they were a victim because they took out a loan and now are unable to repay it. No, if they weren't going to be able to repay it, they shouldn't have taken it out. We need to have people be responsible for their bad investment decisions.
I get where you're coming from. Personal responsibility matters, and loans aren't forced on anyone. But the system's stacked against young people. Colleges and lenders often oversell degrees, hyping job prospects, while downplaying risks, especially for 18-year-olds with little financial know-how. It's not fraud in a legal sense for most, but it's predatory when schools push worthless degrees, knowing grads won't earn enough to repay. Shutting down federal loans might sound good, but it'd lock out low-income folks from education entirely. Private lenders are even less forgiving. Forgiveness, paired with fixing the system, like tying loans...
Hang on a second. One of the things that you said there was that you don't think that these, at least this is, I think, implicitly what you said, if not explicitly, is that these colleges and universities aren't providing enough value for these individuals who are taking these loans to go there to actually be able to pay it back, which means that ultimately we should shut down the federal student loan system because it's not actually adding enough value to justify its cost. Do I have that understanding correct?
You're partly right, but let me clarify. I didn't say colleges provide no value. Many degrees still boost earnings, but not all. Some schools, especially for-profit ones, churn out grads with debt and no job prospects, which is where the system fails. Shutting down federal loans entirely would gut access to education for millions who rely on them, and that's not what I'm advocating. Instead, forgiveness could target those trapped by bad programs, paired with reforms like tying loans to a program's proven return on investment. That way, we protect access while weeding out predatory schools.
Here's the problem, though. Here's the problem with what you're saying. This creates a massive moral hazard. If someone was legitimately defrauded by an institution, they can sue. They can already sue civilly. You don't need to have federal student loan forgiveness for that. If someone was defrauded by someone, they were lied to, they can go ahead and sue for that. But if someone was not defrauded, was not lied to, they took out a loan and it was they had a major where they're not able to pay back their money, you cannot socialize the cost of that by having taxpayers bail them out without creating a massive moral hazard. Because if people think that they can go to institutions that are unlikely to provide enough in value for them to be able to pay back the loan, but they know that the government will bail them out if they're wrong, they're going to do less research up front on if who they're giving their money to, the institution that they're attending, is actually a worthwhile investment of their time and money. If they know government will bail them out, they won't do as much initial research and evaluation of whether it's actually worth attending. And so it'll actually create a increase in people who are attending institutions that are not worth the costs. And so all that student loan forgiveness would do is make the problem worse. Another thing that I want to mention here is it seems to me like it is fundamentally unfair, even if you means test it. Because if you say we're going to provide up to $10,000 or $20,000 in student loans forgiveness, and we're going to means test it at something severe, like cap it at $40,000. You have to have your annual income being $40,000 or less in order to qualify for the loan forgiveness, and you can only get $10,000 to $20,000. It's still fundamentally unfair because you could have two single moms who are each earning $40,000. One of them has $20,000 in student loan debt. The other doesn't have any student loan debt because they made a responsible financial decision not to go to college. And now one is getting $20,000 in the form of student loan debt and the other is getting nothing. And the one who's getting nothing is the one who actually made the financially responsible decision. And so once again, you're actually rewarding people for poor financial decisions and you're actually punishing people for good financial decisions.
I hear you on the moral hazard concern. It's real. If people expect bailouts, they might take bigger risks. And that's why forgiveness needs guardrails, like stricter loan approvals or caps on tuition increases. But on fairness, your example of the two single moms misses a key point. The one with debt isn't necessarily less responsible. She might have been pushed into college by a system that markets degrees as the only path to stability, while the other mom had different circumstances, maybe family support or a trade skill.
Pause though, hang on. You're essentially still running down this argument that people who are told that going to college is the only pathway to success shouldn't have to do research to evaluate whether that claim is true. And that because someone or society told them that, and then they went and took out the student loan, that therefore it's acceptable to force the majority of taxpayers who never got a bachelor's degree to actually fund the student loan forgiveness of the individual who didn't do their own research before taking out a loan. This is a serious, serious problem. It creates humongous moral hazard, not only in the industry of student loans, but in those who are going to be taking out mortgages, because they'll understand, well, maybe not understand, but those who will be taking out mortgages will think to themselves, if with student loans, people who didn't properly evaluate the risk of taking out the debt were bailed out by the government, then if I don't properly evaluate and understand the risk I'm taking and signing this dotted line for this mortgage, then the government might just come and bail me out too. The private equity firms, the VC firms might think the same thing. Big banks might think the same thing. And so ultimately all that this does is it just creates humongous moral hazard extending far beyond the student loan industry. It creates a massive incentive for colleges to actually further increase prices because they know Big Daddy government will just come in and pay them, even if they know that they could never expect the students to ever be able to pay them back, or for private banks to actually be able to fund these loans if they raise prices or even keep prices where they at because they're already extremely high as a result of the bloated amount of money coming from these federal student loans. And so I'm still yet to see what the advantage is of forgiving federal student loans.
You're hitting hard on moral hazard, and I get it. Encouraging risky behavior is a problem. But the idea that forgiveness automatically spirals into bailing out mortgages or banks ignores that we can design targeted policies. Forgiveness could be a one-time reset for existing borrowers, coupled with reforms like tying loans to degree value or capping tuition to stop colleges from price gouging.
Except it's never a one-time thing. I mean, this is the same thing when you just draw a parallel here. I'm not going to get off topic, but it's the same thing when you amnesty undocumented immigrants. When you amnesty undocumented immigrants, all you do is you get more illegal immigration because people think if they come here and there's enough of them, there's going to be another amnesty. That's why you never do an amnesty in the first place. And that's why you should never do a bailout of student loans in the first place. It just makes the problem worse.
I hear your analogy, and the concern about setting a precedent is valid. Amnesty or bailouts can signal, do it again. But student loan forgiveness can be structured differently, like a one-time relief for existing debt with strict new rules to prevent future spirals, such as limiting loans to high-value degrees or freezing tuition hikes. Unlike immigration, where enforcement is trickier, loan systems are centralized, so we can enforce reforms. The advantage is real. $1.7 trillion in debt drags down the economy. Forgiving even $10,000 for low-income borrowers could boost spending and growth.
Wait, hang on. Just a quick point on the the canceling 1.7, I think you said $1 billion. Yeah, $1 billion yeah, I'm pretty sure you said billion, on the however much money it is, right? The quick point on that, I mean, you can just make the same argument for mortgages. You can make the same argument for bad small business loans. You can make the same argument for bad investments from big banks. I mean, where does it end? If the argument's just, you get this increase in discretionary spending or an increase in disposable income, I mean, you can get the same thing if you just bail out everyone who took a small business loan and it didn't work out. And all you do is you create the same moral hazard.
I actually said $1.7 trillion.
Sorry, 1.7 trillion.
No worries, easy mix-up. Your point about bailouts creating moral hazard across industries like mortgages or small business loans is fair, but student debt's unique. Unlike business loans or mortgages, it's often taken by young people with little financial literacy, pushed by a system that overpromises college payoffs. Forgiveness could be a targeted fix, say $10,000 for low-income borrowers, paired with reforms like tying future loans to job market outcomes or capping interest rates to avoid endless debt traps. This doesn't mean bailing out every bad decision. It's about addressing a broken education system. What specific reforms would you propose to make college loans fairer without forgiveness?
Just one point here. Hang on a second. When you say cap the interest rates on the student loans, you can't set an arbitrary cap on an interest rate. Someone's going to have to pay whatever the real interest rate is. And so if you were to say, you can't charge more than 1% interest annually on federal student loans for the rest of time. Well, assuming that the real interest rate is higher than that, which I would expect it to be, ultimately someone's going to end up paying that interest if the person who took out the loan isn't, and that would be the taxpayers in the case of a federal student loans. And so you'd have to tell me why exactly the majority of Americans who don't have a bachelor's degree should be funding the interest on the loans of those who do have a bachelor's degree and are going to have higher net lifetime earnings on average. It doesn't make any sense.
You're right that capping interest rates doesn't make the cost vanish. Someone's got to cover it, and taxpayers shouldn't just eat that for no reason. My point wasn't to arbitrarily cap rates, but to align them with actual risk and ensure they don't balloon debt forever, like how some borrowers pay for decades.
Hang on a second. I just want to ask you something. Who's going to be better at determining what the appropriate rate of interest is relative to the risk? The federal government or private banks?
Private banks are generally better at setting interest rates based on risk. They're incentivized to assess creditworthiness accurately to avoid losses. The federal government, with its one-size-fits-all approach, often ignores individual risk factors, which can lead to mispriced loans and taxpayers footing the bill. But private banks can also gouge borrowers with high rates, especially vulnerable ones.
They can't set whatever interest rates they want, because if they set them way too high, then other banks will come in and undercut them. They can't set the interest rates at whatever they want. That's not true.
You're absolutely right. Banks can't just slap on sky-high interest rates without competition driving them down. If one bank overcharges, others will offer lower rates to snag borrowers, assuming a functional market. But for student loans, the government's heavy involvement distorts that competition, letting some lenders exploit gaps. My point was that private banks are better at risk assessment, but without oversight, they can still take advantage of naive borrowers, especially kids fresh out of high school. How would you set up a system?
Whoa, hang on. You're so wrong. How is a bank that provides a private loan, not talking about federal student loans, private loans, a bank that takes a private loan that is not paid back, taking advantage of someone? The bank is the one who's not getting their money back. They're the ones who are getting screwed over if they make a loan that they don't get a return on. It's not in their interest to do that.
Okay, I hear you. And you're right that banks lose out if private loans aren't repaid. They're not trying to throw money away. My point wasn't that banks are screwing borrowers by giving loans that default. It's that some private lenders can exploit naive borrowers with high interest rates or unclear terms, knowing young people often don't shop around or understand the fine print. Competition should keep rates fair, but in practice, some banks target vulnerable borrowers who don't compare options. How would you ensure borrowers are savvy enough to navigate private loan markets without getting trapped by bad deals?
That's a decent question. not great question, but a decent question. I'd say a simple thing to do would actually make sure that individuals are receiving enough education in, math in high school to recognize that it's probably a wise idea to get a quote from at least multiple people who are offering student loans that you can compare the rates. I mean, I don't know what you want me to say other than that people who are taking out student loans shouldn't be idiots and should get multiple quotes so that they can find the private loan provider with the best rate. I mean, I seriously don't know what you want me to say other than that.
Fair enough. You're not wrong. Basic financial literacy in high school, like teaching kids to compare loan rates, would go a long way. People should shop around and not just sign the first offer they see. But the reality is, a lot of 18-year-olds don't know to do that, and some lenders bank on that inexperience, offering teaser rates.
I'm gonna try to bring it back to the main point of contention here, because I think we're getting a little bit off topic. What, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that the morally correct thing to do in regards to student loan debt is to forgive it, whether it's means tested or not?
I'd say I'm about a 6 out of 10 on student loan forgiveness being the morally right move, whether means tested or not. It's not a slam dunk. Your points on fairness and moral hazard are legit, and blanket forgiveness could set a bad precedent. But I lean toward targeted relief because the system's rigged against young people with insane tuition and predatory lending, and forgiveness could ease that burden while we fix the root issues. Where do you stand on a 1 to 10 scale for keeping student loans as is, no forgiveness at all?
Well, I don't believe that we should keep student loans as is. Obviously, I believe that we should end the federal student loan system altogether. I also think we should privatize most of the public colleges and universities, but that's a different topic. So I'd say I'm at a 9 out of 10 in my confidence that we should not forgive federal student loans. I think that would be a disaster. I do want to ask you, though, I think you said you were at like a 6 or a 6.5. What would move you to a 4?
A 9. That's strong conviction. For me to drop to a 4 on forgiveness being morally right, I'd need clearer evidence that it'd massively spike tuition or create widespread moral hazard across other sectors, like you mentioned with mortgages or business loans. If data showed that targeted forgiveness still led to reckless borrowing without fixing the system, like if colleges kept jacking up prices unchecked, that'd make me worrier. What would nudge you down from a 9, even just to an 8, on opposing forgiveness?
That's a good question.
Anyway.
I don't think I would move to an 8. I don't think that I could. The only reason I'm at it, first of all, I think a better question would have been, why am I not at a 10 than a 9? But the reason I'm not at a 10 would just be that I have some amount of sympathy for the individuals who were given federal student loans. And obviously the federal student loan providers aren't checking if there's a high likelihood of them being able to pay it back, whereas a private bank would. And so the fact that we have a federal student loan system obviously is create part of what caused this massive problem. And so I have some sympathy for the individuals there, but I still don't think that someone is a victim if someone gives them access to capital and they willingly take it. So that's why I'm at a 9 and not a 10. As for what could move me to a 7 or an 8, the reality is for me almost nothing. And the reason for that is that I don't believe that stealing is morally acceptable, whether it's done through the government or not. So just like I would oppose someone stealing money from a construction worker to give to someone who got a bachelor's degree and has student debt, I'd oppose the same exact thing when it's done through the veil of government. And so I don't think that you can detach the moral principles of theft being wrong. I don't think you can detach that from economics. I think that you have to have economics have a moral foundation, and that moral foundation has to include that it's wrong to steal. And so that's why I don't think I can move from a 9 to an 8 or a 9 to 7, because to do so, I would pretty much have to abandon the principle that it's wrong to steal, which is something that I'm not willing to do.
I respect the firm stance. Holding to principles like theft being wrong gives you a clear line, and I get why you're at a 9. Your point about federal loans fueling the problem is spot on. They've inflated costs by flooding the system with easy money. I'd only push back that forgiveness isn't exactly stealing if it's a policy choice to address a broken system. Taxpayers fund lots of things, like roads or schools.
Sounds like the AI just glitched out. I think that's enough, honestly. So I think we'll end it there. But hopefully you found the conversation between me and the AI interesting. Hopefully you were kind of able to hear the points that both sides make. I think ultimately, I think my position is correct. That's why I hold it. But I think that was actually a pretty decent conversation covering the arguments that both sides would make on the issue. There's probably a few more things that I could have mentioned there, but I think overall it was a good conversation. If you enjoyed this video, then consider subscribing. You can check the description for ways that you can support me, and I'll see you in the next video.